elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome to Society and the State. Brian Hyde here along with Connor Boyack. We thought it might be fun to talk a little bit about predictions. No, we haven't dusted off our crystal ball so that we can tell you, how things are going. We don't have any tea leaves to read or anything. But, Connor, a lot of predictions have been made about the world that we live in, and quite frankly, a lot of these predictions have turned out to be utterly false. The first one that comes to mind, just because I was a child in the 70s, was Paul Ehrlich, who prophesied or predicted that, the world is going to run out of food and there's going to be mass starvation. I think he was saying, before the 21st century would begin. I don't know about you, but if anything, I'm probably a little too well fed.
Well, and so thinking back to that scenario, did a lot of people believe him? Was that a prediction that kind of caught on?
The modern environmental movement, actually, I think that was the foundation on which it started. Was we've got to do something, and I don't know. Look, I don't want to make it sound like we're saying everybody's crazy for believing that bad things could happen. Certainly, some really strange things have happened throughout human history, but sometimes the predictions are just so dire. And sometimes they're so motivated just to stampede people in a specific direction that you have to wonder, how did people ever fall for that? Maybe we should start with, let's talk about climate change.
Oh, boy.
And where that leads. See, as a kid, in first grade, there was a lovely lady who would come to my school, and she would sing songs to us on the guitar about the ecology of the environment and how we should never upset the balance of nature. But you know what our biggest fear was? It wasn't global warming. Our biggest fear was that the next ice age was going to have us all living in caves and running for our lives from saber-toothed tigers.
Well, and I think the easiest pickings here, the low-hanging fruit, of course, is Al Gore. With the documentary that he did, it's been 12 years ago now, I think it was 2006, called An Inconvenient Truth. And you had all of these predictions that were made about what was going to happen. The polar ice caps were going to melt, and very specific predictions.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of doomsday, a lot of, gloom and doom and fear mongering.
New York will be underwater.
Yeah, that's awfully specific. Like, you got to think you're a cult leader talking about, like, the Mayan calendar or the second coming of Christ or whatever to hinge your status and your whatever on the credibility amongst your following on a very specific claim that if you're not true, that it doesn't come to pass as you predict, what does that happen to your legitimacy, your credibility, your status? And yet Al Gore's kind of doubling down. He did another documentary, and he keeps on going. But you look at the predictions that are made, and it's one thing to have someone make a crackpot idea or a claim that may be sincere, well-founded, well-researched, whatever. The problem here, the thing that I'd like to focus on at least a little bit in this episode is not just the failed predictions. It's easy to kind of armchair quarterback, right? Oh, look how wrong he was, ha, 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 right? Whatever. It's not just some guy sitting on a couch or at a computer making predictions. What I'm concerned about is when those predictions are used as the basis to encourage or in many cases require and force people into adapting their lives, into changing their actions based on someone else's predictions. So when you get an Al Gore stand-up and all the pop culture and all the journalists and all the legislators and all the bureaucrats start buying into this prediction and into this message, when taxes start being used for issues and projects that are connected to that prediction, that's where I take issue. When I am forced through, in this case, my tax dollars especially, to subsidize and support a project based on a false prediction, that's where I think the problem comes in.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why I've been a climate change skeptic, and I remain one. I don't doubt that there are changes that are taking place, but there's a part of me that just says, isn't it convenient that not only is the cure, or at least the fix for this problem, if we just give government enough power and allow them to tax us or tax these resources at a higher rate, we can fix everything. And it hasn't escaped my observation or other people's observation that often the people who are pushing this the hardest are individuals whose funding to do what they do comes from the very same government that stands to be expanded. I'm all for happy coincidences, and I'm all for, hey, isn't it great how that worked out? But it just seems a little bit self-serving. So if that makes me a denier, then so be it.
Let's use the first example that you shared about the food scarcity issue, and let's assume for purposes of conversation that it was an accurate prediction, that at the time, based on the then available technology, right, agriculture was a lot slower, it was more cumbersome, it was much more energy intensive, right, and so perhaps you can make a case that had they remained at the status quo, with the population increasing, it would have been very difficult to feed all those new mouths and so forth. The problem that I think a lot of these false predictions have involved, or the Achilles heel of a lot of these predictions, is that they don't anticipate technological developments that render them moot. They don't anticipate in the example that we're talking about here that new technologies would come up that would allow you to produce far more food with a lot less energy input on a lot less land. And so farmers can now be far more productive than they ever were with machinery and, pesticides or whatever, right? Things that they're using in order to harvest, grow and harvest a lot more. So I think technology is something that, even for the well-meaning predictions, renders them moot. I mean, I've got a list here. I'm not going to share them all, but there's some of these ideas that were shared that clearly people could not anticipate technological changes in the future. So, like, one is Lee DeForest. This guy invented the vacuum tube, huge technological advancement that was used on a lot of different components and equipment and so forth. He was an American radio pioneer, right? So this guy says in 1926, so about 90 years ago almost, he says, to place a man in a multi-stage rocket and project him into the controlling gravitational field of the moon, where the passengers can make scientific observations, perhaps land alive and then return to Earth. All that constitutes a wild dream worthy of Jules Verne. I'm bold enough to say that such a man-made voyage will never occur regardless of all future advances. So he's not even saying, like, based on the technology then available. He's saying, like, period, at all. You'll never have this at all. You have a physicist, part of the British Royal Society, Lord Kelvin, at the end of the 1800s, saying heavier than air flying machines are impossible, right? So some of this stuff, like Albert Einstein, he says there's not the slightest indication that nuclear energy will ever be obtainable. It would mean that the atom would have to be shattered at will. And of course, these people can't anticipate that the future is going to change. You have the executives at IBM telling the folks who started Xerox, this was in the late 50s, saying the total potential in the entire world for copying machines is 5,000 at most, right? Like, people's inability to anticipate the future and to anticipate technology and the way that technology transforms our lives, I think, is kind of a common pattern that we see in a lot of these predictions.
I thought of you the other day when I was attending my son's 6th grade graduation, because his principal said something that reminded me of a comment you had made on this very podcast.
What's that?
And he was talking about the kids. He was saying, these kids are graduating, 6th grade. In another 6 years, they'll be graduating high school and maybe going on to college. And he started asking the kids, what do you want to be? What are you thinking about being? And then when about 4 kids had answered, he says, would it surprise you folks to know that about 65% of these kids will be working jobs that haven't even been created yet? And I went, Connor and I have talked about this.
Bingo.
But that's the nature. Technology is changing things so quickly. Maybe I'm suspending my skepticism here, but I wouldn't be surprised. 10, 12 years from now, there will be a lot of jobs that currently don't exist.
And yet, to build on your tangent really quick, our systems of education and culture and everything else are training people for obsolescence.
Yeah.
I mean, how damning is that really of the system, right? That it's not innovating and adapting to those environments. Super interesting. So what's the concern here, Brian? I mean, do you agree with me? It seems like and we hear a lot of these predictions now, like foreign policy is a huge one, right? Like, this dictator is going to get this, like, a weapon of mass destruction, right? Or Iran.
In 6 months, Iran will have the bomb. I've been listening for 10 years to Bibi Netanyahu talk about how Iran will have a bomb within 6 months.
Yeah. Yeah, and he always holds up the chart, the UN Security Council, the little bomb with, like, the measuring, whatever. And so you have, like, North Korea or Iran, they're always going to have, these things that there's a lot of urgency. We have to get this done. And Libya and Yemen and all of these things. And of course, all these seem to justify government programs, intervention, more taxpayer spending. It seems to be a way to deceive people into accepting a course of action that they otherwise wouldn't. Is that kind of the issue at stake that you're seeing?
No, I think that's exactly what it amounts to. And one of the questions that comes to mind is, why do we fall for it? Is it because we want to believe the worst? I'm trying to delve into the human nature that obviously it's an effective tool to move people or to move the herd in a direction that they want to move us. Why do we fall for it? You'd think we'd be smarter than that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a powerful psychological effect here. We've talked in a past episode about fear and the ability to kind of overcome your rational portion of your brain because this kind of base psychological influence kicks in and it actually circumvents the rational area of your brain. And so you become much more susceptible to reacting to what that external threat or perceived threat is. And so there's something very science-y happening here, right? Very psychological, very fundamental in our brains that makes it hard to not react, to not be susceptible to those things. It's why we see so many of these kind of apocalyptic doomsday things. It's why we were all enthralled by the Mayan calendar in 2012, right?
Y2K.
Oh man, huge one, right? Like the predictions that were happening around Y2K were crazy. And yet it comes and goes and like it wasn't really a big deal at all, right? And so, yeah, we are guilty of it. And I think, the media buys into it. It's good for clicks. It's controversial. So we all get kind of sucked into it because it's all we hear about. I don't know. It is kind of those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. And we seem to be on auto repeat here with just over and over and over again.
So let me throw a name out there. I just want to kind of throw a little wrench in the works here and just get your reaction.
Mm-hmm.
George Orwell.
Yeah.
1984.
Yeah.
Very, very famous novel. I think a lot of people, and I would buy into this too, I think that because of his close association with the Spanish Civil War, he saw communism and fascism up close, and I think he really was writing that as a warning. I don't think it was just entertainment or some dystopian fantasy for him. I think he was really trying to send a bit of a warning message. What are your thoughts? 1984.
Yeah.
Those who say that's not the future, I think it actually is descriptive of our present and our past in some ways.
I don't disagree. And I think, as a Christian, I think of the way Jesus often taught with parables that are applicable not just to one set of circumstances, but many, right? Like we can, if you're in Germany or if you're in Zimbabwe or if you're in Texas, like there are events happening in your community or in your culture that are applicable to those more generalized parables and stories. And so I think that the same thing with 1984 is, as you say, it's applying, I think, to the present. It's certainly going to apply to the future. And when you put it into kind of that abstract storytelling, I think it becomes a little easier to adapt to different circumstances. You don't have to perfectly fit, a set of circumstances to the story. I've thought about that too, that you get a story like that, or even like Animal Farm, right? That was very descriptive of the government under which he lived. And yet you can see symbolism, you see examples of application to our own day, to our own government.
And my whole point in bringing that up is just to point out that even though it may sound like we're just poo-pooing, oh yeah, all the predictions that failed, sometimes some people come very close to getting it right. Aldous Huxley and Brave New World, another example. In fact, I don't think it's an either-or thing. Either he was right or Orwell was right. In Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, people allowed themselves to be drugged into this sense of apathy to where nothing else really mattered. And I would submit that our video screens they're kind of a form of soma, like Huxley wrote about.
Soma, I forgot about that. Let me venture a guess here, Brian, because I'm really intrigued by what you're saying. Seems to me that the predictions that are tied more to human nature are easier to make than those that are applicable to the climate or to technology, right? What I mean by that is I shared the quote a moment ago about those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. And that's in part because history repeats itself. It's cyclical. You look at the Kondratiev cycle. We should do an episode on the Kondratiev cycle. That'd be super interesting. The fourth turning and a lot of these.
Definitely.
The cyclical nature of history. And so when you base your future predictions on this cycle, when you see that throughout world history, especially in Western society, these events have transpired over and over, and it's because of kind of the rise and the fall and the new generations responding to their elders in a certain way. And this stuff becomes cyclical to the point where, not with any like specific degree of accuracy, kind of like with 1984, when you abstract it just enough, you can see that something like that is going to happen in the future. You can write a story and say, look, I anticipate a future in which people will have this moral decay because they will have this time of prosperity that was born out of humility and crisis, and so they rebuild and become prosperous. but then the next generation takes that for granted and they become, decayed and entitled, and it kind of falls apart, and then they start all over again. You can look at that cycle and you can, I think, reasonably, quote unquote, predict what the future is going to look like, not because of those external influences of technology or climate or whatever is transpiring around them, but just because the way humans respond to one another, and then the history is kind of a good predictor, I think, of the present and the future. Would you agree?
I think it's an absolute truism that human nature has remained remarkably consistent. And anyone who has taken the pains of going back and reading old books, if you go back and you read the kind of things that, things that Herodotus was writing about, as a historian, or just any of the great philosophers over the last 3,000 years or so, we still struggle with the very same human nature questions that they did. Mm-hmm. The times and the circumstances changed. Human nature, though, has remained incredibly consistent.
And when you look at America contrasted against something like the Roman Republic and Empire, it's very eerie the degree to which there's a lot of things that line up between the two. And you can kind of use that, not necessarily to, specify a very explicit prediction on a certain day or a certain year, but as kind of the general trend, the direction in which we're going. It's like the palm readers, oh, do you have a wife? Oh, well, yes, I do,
You're reading me like a book.
Yeah. Did you happen to meet her in college? Why, yes, And so when you're general enough, it becomes easier to make those predictions. The concern, of course, as we've said, is when they get so specific that they scare people into accepting something, and when they justify this government intervention, these problems. I think for our day, it's important to be to analyze the past enough to not predict the future, but to anticipate kind of those broader concerns and be able to adapt to them. And I think, Brian, to be able to recognize these false prophets, I'll call them, for what they are. This doomsday scenario, the whipping the public into a fervor. We see that on the religious side when you get kind of culty, when we see it on the political side too, when you get Al Gore, right? And so they're very similar, where I think we can learn from the past enough to stay away from those types of people, develop a sort of immunity about what they're doing, but still be anticipating the future based on what we've learned from the past.
And that's actually the next question I wanted to ask you. So this will be my final question for you. For the average person to be able to sort between what is real and what isn't, even if it's just to maintain a healthy sense of skepticism, any rules of thumb that you like to go by when you're presented with, scary information, or you sense that someone is trying to tell you it's apocalyptic, it's coming?
That's a super important question. When I wrote Feardom, that was kind of a question I often got, which was, well, who do you trust, right? Like which journalist or which media sources can I look to, since we had so much abundant evidence of people who were doing the wrong stuff? And so I think it's a similar question. It's how do you immunize yourself? How do you prepare yourself against that type of stuff? The thing that I've tried to do the most is to not be reactive. Those who are whipped into a fervor, those who kind of respond off the cuff and believe this report that they read, or this, journalist or this politician, they don't do their due diligence. They don't do their homework to see what other people are saying, to see if there's been a response or someone to debunk. The thing that I've tried to do is to not believe anything that has not been substantiated by other credible people in a very rational way, not in this kind of Al Gore doomsday kind of way, but are there other people who are calmly analyzing this, who I trust, who I think are being credible? It's kind of the biblical, out of the mouth of two or three witnesses shall all truth be established. And so let's try and gather other witnesses for these claims that are being made and see if there's any consensus. Now, of course, it's claimed that there's consensus, Brian, for global warming and all this kind of stuff. The scientific community has,
the science is settled.
Right, exactly. So consensus is not perfect, but I think that's at least a good insulation first, especially if the consensus is from people who are not incentivized to have a certain opinion. When you have the science community that lives off of grants, especially government grants, and they'd love to funnel all that new money into research so that they can take advantage of it, I think you have a misallocation or an incentive to hold a certain opinion versus another. But if you have rational actors, third-party people calmly analyzing something who you trust, who have a past of having that trustworthiness, you've seen them in the past, I think that's where you begin to have that insulation. Do you have any other thoughts as we part here of what individuals can do to prepare and to insulate themselves?
No, I just like you said, be on the lookout. If someone's trying to make you fear, start asking, why are they trying to make me afraid?
Yeah.
That's a real good place to start.
Excellent. All right, guys, stick around for the next episode. Speaking of fear, we're going to be talking to Anthony Randazzo from the Reason Foundation. Interesting conversation about being $21 trillion in debt and what that means for you and for me. So make sure you're subscribed. Stick around for next time. We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.